the marketplace's perception of your brand is the sum total of the interactions that the marketplace has had with you. If the marketplace doesn't have interactions with you, you got a pretty shit brand.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 305. We're going to be talking about music marketing's best and most famous dance partner, branding. I think this is going to be a fun episode. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is your other host, my awesome co-pilot and friend, Circa. Cirque, are you excited to discuss my favorite pet peeve, branding?
Yeah, I'm very excited.
Me too. I think branding gets a little bit of a bad rap, at least with me, because I so often hear from artists and bands and musicians, like, I don't want to do the thing you're asking me to do because it's not on brand for me. And I think this is going to be a really fun episode so that we can define what brand actually means and how you can apply a brand to your artist project, to your band, how you can build one if you've never built one before, how you can think differently about what brand actually means to you and use it effectively to make yourself more known to your fans, to give them something that is a lasting impression about you and the stuff that you're making.
Yeah. How should we start off here?
Man, I guess we should probably start by talking about the elements of starting a brand or brainstorming a brand from an artist's perspective. I think that would probably be helpful. And we've got some resources for you guys that we'll talk about a little bit later in the show that will help you kickstart some of these ideas and maybe get the gears turning in your head if you've never thought about this kind of stuff before. But Cirque, what are we talking about when we really talk about brand?
What are we talking about, or what are most other people talking about?
Well, let's define both. That's a really good point.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a bit of a nebulous concept, and certainly like all terms are subjectively defined, but this one is often a bit more subjectively defined. What I understand brand to mean is that it is a set of expectations and assumptions that are built over time for a person or a company, or even any noun could have a brand, quote unquote. But more directly, like, it's often a person or a company, person or a business. And it is the assumptions that the marketplace tends to have about this company or person, specifically those that are intentionally put out into the marketplace by that company or person. So it's like, what do you want people to come to expect of you? What is your stated mission and purpose? What are the things by which people will recognize you? And what can people generally presume about your behavior in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty sound and safe definition. You know, it's almost textbook definition. How does the music industry think about or relate to brand? Man, we could probably even break that down into multiple definitions, but how does the music industry and a lot of artists and bands that we interact with often bring up the concept of brand? What does it mean? I think it's very nebulous when defined in that context.
Yeah, I think people often conflate brand with reputation, which certainly your brand can include your reputation. But the thing is that if you don't define what your entity or you as a person is setting out to achieve, what is your mission and vision, then generally what you want your reputation to be is completely disconnected from your purpose. And it's more tied to, what do you think is like moral praxis? Like, what do you think is like good, being a good person? For example, Tesla is a very powerful brand. Its entire vision statement is to speed up the adoption and proliferation of renewable energy. And its mission at any one time, the difference between a vision and a mission: vision is big picture, long term. What are you headed towards? Mission is locally, what are you doing to achieve that vision? And so their mission is to create and offer the most desirable electric vehicle at scale, ever. And that mission has creeped over time. But that's just to say that, like, Tesla is not anti-pollution. Tesla is not green. It's entirely focused on this goal of renewable energy. And really not even saying we want to like change minds about renewable energy, just to say that we want to speed it up. We assume the assumption is that this is going to be a thing regardless. How do we make it a thing faster? And so everything they do is about that. Every single thing that they do is headed towards that vision. So it's not necessarily about Tesla's reputation, except as that's a consequence of how do we get to full scale renewable energy saturation faster.
Right. That's a super helpful example of like a local versus a global mission and vision, what those things mean and how they relate to one another.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could say that like there are things Tesla may do that may give it a worse reputation. But as long as it's consistent with that vision, it doesn't matter. It's still good branding. A lot of people leave out of branding or over index on it the things that you do, right? So there are people who think that brand is a logo, a set of colors, a typeface. And these are important branding elements, but those should all be derived from like, is this consistent with your vision, with what you want to do? Now, on the other side of the coin, there's people who think that your brand is entirely the things that you do and what reputation they give you. So there's a lot of confusion about it. And to be honest, like, you know, one person's confusion may be another person's consistency. One person may have a definition of branding that, and they think that the way that they treat it is exactly how it should be. And I can't necessarily tell them they're wrong.
Yeah. It's funny because it does get gray in that way, I think, when we talk about branding, especially because you and I feel like a lot of people, and maybe I'm making a sweeping statement here, but I feel like a lot of people have probably interacted with or enjoyed a brand who, by definition standards and everything we just talked about, don't really fit the models or the concepts very well by like any kind of textbook standard. You know, they've come to a brand by the things that they've done or the impact that they've made. And then the rest has been packaging that's been made around it, sometimes thrown together. Like they built the airplane and then they started flying, and then everything kind of, all the niceties and the paint and the ribbons and the bows came later, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think also like it's important to understand. I guess like it's hard for me to make like clear statements here because brand is nebulous, because you can have your own definition of what a brand is, and that's fine. There is no central authority on the definition of brand. But in my mind, a lot of people screw up marketing and sales in the name of some undefined, you know, moving target brand they want to uphold.
This is why it's my pet peeve word.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Brand and marketing can be the best dance partners, or they can be, you know, two opposing states at war with each other, depending on how you steer them.
Yeah. So brand is something that your marketing wants to communicate, but marketing's job is not just to communicate your brand, right? And certainly, like, how do I say it? Let's picture your business or your artistic career as a machine. It has a purpose. It is literally designed to achieve a purpose. And that purpose is probably stated pretty clearly in your vision statement. But your vision statement does not drill down to the way the gears are arranged. Your vision statement doesn't have to drill down to what kind of fuel source this thing has. That should be the net result of what the machine is doing. If you try to implement that at every level of the machine, you're going to build a subpar engine here. So yeah, like oftentimes like marketing and sales, marketing is really like making known. It is the attention grabbing. It is the spread and proliferation of information that directs people towards sales. And sales is converting that attention and capitalizing on that information being spread to create a transaction. Transactions are the fuel source of any business. And what they're fueling that business towards is your vision. So if you completely screw up your fuel source, like if you completely screw up your fuel source because it's not consistent with the direction that you're headed, you're not going to head anywhere, really.
Yeah.
Sort of like mixing metaphors.
It's the idea of you have a brand, but no people to recognize it. You have a brand in your head, but you're the only one who knows that brand.
At the end of the day, the marketplace's perception of your brand is the sum total of the interactions that the marketplace has had with you. If the marketplace doesn't have interactions with you, you got a pretty shit brand, right?
Yeah.
Like it's weak.
Yeah.
And certainly if your business or your venture fails because you failed to create any fuel or any transaction volume, like that's not great for your long-term vision either, right? So like if Tesla failed to sell any cars, that wouldn't really help speed up the proliferation of renewable energy, would it? So yeah, like you cannot sacrifice like the engine of a business or the fuel of a business in the name of brand. I think that's a major misstep.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There's been a number of conversations that I've had over the years with artists, and in particular, artist managers speaking on behalf of their artists who think they have a very clear idea of a brand and what it means for this artist or band to be who they are, and how a marketing idea, concept, or a sales initiative is in conflict with that brand. And oftentimes the conversation comes to a point where it's like, if you want your marketing and sales components of your business to succeed, I suggest in the short term that you divorce them from the idea of brand for the sake of the brand.
Yeah. Maybe we should drill down to some specific examples here, because I think we've gone over a lot of definitions and then like definitionally derived like problems, but like let's get down to brass tacks. Like what's an example of a time when you feel that like someone has abused the notion of brand to be self-damning?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, this is an overarching example, I would say, not necessarily a specific one. I'll give a specific one in a second. An overarching example is the mysterious artist brand that so many artists love to take on the mantle of. I'm mysterious. I want to appear, in the shadows, and I don't want to be super accessible, and I'm brooding, and I make music in my cave, and then I give it to my people and they love it. And that is a brand ideal that people sometimes like to hold close to themselves. So then when it comes time to marketing the actual art that they're making, they say, well, I don't want to do a video where I show my face. I would much rather have abstract visuals be the thing that catch people's attention. And it's like, well, you can do that, but it's going to cost you a lot more money to get people's attention. And we don't really know if it's going to capture their attention. So you can see this tug of war going on a little bit. That's a broad example that I've seen happen time and time again, especially in like singer-songwriter genres, indie rock type genres, in the jazz world. I've seen it kind of exist in those areas in particular. And even getting into like the harder, heavier music, rock, metal, stuff like that, it definitely lives there.
Tons of hip hop artists.
Yeah, hip hop artists too. I guess it is kind of universal.
Yeah.
I don't know if I see it too much in country. Country artists seem to be pretty like, I want to be approachable. I want to talk to people. Most country artists that I've talked to are pretty gregarious.
Yeah. So given that example, there's a few problems I'll point out. One is there are no successful major artists who are mysterious and brooding. There just aren't any. Like sure, you can point out a couple of examples. They're the exceptions to the rule.
Yeah.
And every rule has them. I remember, what was it, Captain something? Everyone thought it was Tyler, the Creator, for a while, or maybe Thundercat, but it was this mysterious music project. Let me look it up real quick. Captain Murphy, that was it. Everyone couldn't figure out who it is. Now, I had to look it up because Captain Murphy is not a huge name, right?
I have no idea what you're talking about. So
thought to be a pseudonym of like another famous artist, and they were very mysterious. But that's just to say that like I don't know who they are. I don't know what happened with the project. Now, another artist who was very mysterious for a period of time was Dominic Fike. Not anyone had the deets on this kid. We just knew that he, ran up a bidding war between labels to like $4 million advance for no ass reason. And he was mysterious for a period of time. Now he's everywhere. is very visible. Mystery, brooding, this is like perhaps a rollout strategy. It is not a vision statement. Because if your vision statement was, I want to be the most mysterious, brooding, difficult to find information for artist in the world, great. Lock yourself in your room. Don't ever go on the internet. Vision achieved, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess like mystery implies that there is a lot of attention and intrigue, but very little information. It's like, okay, great. How do I create attention and intrigue? Usually it requires big budgets to pull off, despite appearing to not have backing behind it. But I will say this, brand is best in my mind when it's functional. You define a vision first, because then we know what you're heading towards. And then we also know the calculus behind it, because it's like every business or entity or project has constraints. So you define a goal such that you can decide which constraints can I maneuver around, which things am I willing to sacrifice on. Certainly Tesla, in getting to become one of the biggest car companies in the world, had to make compromises on its principles, right? There are things you could say were counterintuitive at the time to ethics or seeming like a good guy, like whatever. But they were willing to compromise on that because what was more important was the long-term vision. And so they knew what to compromise on. It is that which leads us least away from that long-term vision. As an artist, if you don't have a long-term vision, something you're trying to achieve in the world, and it's okay if it's self-serving. It's okay if your long-term vision is, I want to make a bunch of fucking money. Like, that's all right.
Good. Go for it.
Yeah. But like, let's define it very clearly so that we know when we're heading towards and away from it and what compromises are okay to make. And so, yeah, like being really mysterious is not a vision.
I hope not. I hope that's not your vision. Like, it sounds awfully lonely, you know?
Yeah. And also I'll say this, like we've worked with artists who their vision appeared to be, I want to be mysterious and brooding. And I've seen people get major label interest, get dropped by the label, and then have no second act on the basis of that principle, that thing that they really wanted. And it's like, well, certainly not included in your vision statement was falling completely out of the music industry. Like that was not part of it. Yeah, I will say that like people will uphold a brand, but what they really mean is, I think at the end of the day, when it comes to the mysterious thing, is I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be open. I don't want even the possibility that someone could ridicule me. And so I'm just going to completely guard myself.
Yeah, that's a good take. Like, it's the bullied kids.
Yeah.
On the afraid of going to the internet in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You're totally right. I couldn't agree more. I want to touch on something that you mentioned briefly, especially because I think we have something that is going to help folks who are just starting to maybe think about, maybe now, based on what we've talked about so far in this episode, they're thinking a little bit higher level about their brand. They're thinking about mission and vision and the things that they want to be, the statements that they want to make, the assumptions that they want people to have about them in the long term. But there are elements to branding that either get overemphasized or not emphasized enough. And I think they're worth talking about because there's a healthy middle ground to building an actionable brand, at least in the short term, things you can do. So let's talk about brand elements. Let's talk about the brass tacks of logos and typefaces and imagery and the things that influence you and how you find them and catalog them.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that like the reason that when you come up with a logo and a color palette and a fonts like type, there are constraints there. But I think what's often more ignored is how do these things serve or communicate our vision? Because it's, as you may know, as a creative person, it is a lot more difficult to create when you do not have any limitations.
The blank page is your enemy.
Right. Yeah. Limitations force you to creatively problem solve. And if you have zero limitations, you have to make every possible choice. And that's very difficult because you don't want to be wrong about any of your choices. So the more choices that are removed from you, you can focus in on the choices that you actually do have control over and end up coming up with creative solutions. And if you don't have any constraints whatsoever, you're going to make dumb decisions because there's just too many decisions to make. too much to focus on. And so vision constrains, mission constrains these things. It gives you an idea of what your logo should look like. Should it have very like clean lines and sharp corners? Should it be more round and playful? Should it be lineal color? Should it be grayscale? These are things that you can derive from, well, is that consistent with my vision and mission? Color palette is a little bit more difficult, but you can use color psychology to also sort of match up your color palette to those constraints. Like, so there's colors, there's fonts, there's logos. There's also just activities that seem to only serve cementing your brand in the mind of your market. You need a market first, right? So let's not kid ourselves. Like, it makes no sense to do branding activities if no one's listening to you talk.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. But once you do have a captive audience, you have a fan base, then you can do branding activities that reinforce what you're about. You can do things that seem to have no other purpose other than to reinforce what you're about. And those are definitely constrained by your vision.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point to make too, I think, is a lot of times the blank page problem surfaces for artists who, maybe a lot of artists are visual creatives as well. I'm personally not. I don't draw. I'm not very good at graphic design. I have those constraints around me that, like, I would be better suited if you put me in Canva and told me to figure out what my Atlas Jack artist brand was. In fact, when I was working on my last single, that was where I found myself, was just like, 3 glasses of wine deep on a Friday night, just spitting out ideas for cover art with Canva. And it was the most fun I was having ever, because I was just like, well, I'm stuck with this one platform. I've got ideas and I'm going to just go for it. It wasn't a blank page at all. I was like, this is what I have to work with. Here's the photos I have to use. Here's the fonts that I have to use. Here's the colors that I have to use. Go for it. And I had a clear vision of who I was as an artist and what I was trying to do. And so there was kind of that box to work in. But I think a lot of artists are, or many artists are, visually creative, and they like to think about the brand elements maybe more than I do. And it's easy to get stuck on that. It's just as easy to get stuck on that as it is like, well, I probably need to create my LLC and my website and make sure that my logo is trademarked and all of these other, business non-essentials before anybody hears you. The same thing can happen with branding elements and branding activities in general.
Yeah. And I think that, again, branding is especially about consistency, right? Because again, it's about expectations. Like, your brand is one thing in your mind, but it lives in the minds of a marketplace. That's where it actually like becomes real. It's really a big trick you're pulling off, where you have this set of assumptions, a vision, something you want to communicate, what you're about, and then how successful or strong your brand is a consequence of how well did you imprint that on the minds of the marketplace. And so, given that, brands are about consistency. Because if your logo says one thing and what you did as some business decision you made says another thing, and your color palette's all over the place, and your website is crazy, and then your iconography, your photography, your video is all out of whack with that, it's hard to really say what I expect from you. It's all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So how do you achieve consistency? Well, it's best if the constraints around your logo, your photos, your videos, your lyrics, your activities, if the constraints around all those things are identical. So the constraint should always be vision. The constraint is, where are you headed towards and how are we achieving that with this thing? If the constraints are the same, the end product will be very familiar. The end product will, the end result will be very familiar. How you rolled out your newest single will comport with, your logo. It'll comport with what your website looks like. So it's really a template. It's like a base set of assumptions that you place behind every decision you make as a business. And so, yeah, like that said, it's important to realize that I think marketing and sales is fundamental. It sits below all that. Because if you cannot make transaction volume and you cannot make yourself known, there is no imprint.
What's the point?
Yeah. So it's kind of secondary. You don't want to make egregious like deviations from what you say you're about. Like if Tesla came out with a gas powered car because it would sell better, like, yeah, that would be rather inconsistent with their vision. But if Tesla has to hit a certain margin on their vehicles, right? And to create every component of the vehicle without the use of oil at all would just be impossibly expensive, then they wouldn't do it because they cannot function as a business under that constraint, right?
Right. Yep.
So, yes, some of the parts in a Tesla car require the use of oil or are oil, like plastics, right? So, there are key decisions to make where survival as a business comes first.
Yeah. That's a really boiled down way of compartmentalizing marketing and sales, is like your business's survival requires marketing and sales. For the brand to stay alive, marketing and sales is essential. It's required. You can't escape it. You have to make compromises, or you may have to make compromises for it.
Yeah. So anyways, that's all to just say that like if you don't have a vision for what you're trying to achieve that's real to you, then you need to get one. You need to start thinking, sit down with yourself, allocate a half hour of your time and start thinking about, if my music is to achieve something, if my music career is to achieve something, what do I want that to be? And take success monetarily and socially as a given, right? Because if your business succeeds, you'll get those things. Besides that, what do I want to achieve here? And if you can very well define that, then that's your first principle, your base assumption from under which you can work up logo, color type, what your website looks like, how do you communicate with your fans, all that stuff.
It gives you the canvas to work on, the constraints. Yeah.
And also an important note here is that like your vision is not what you think is a successful strategy, because the reason people really want to seem mysterious and dark is because they think that's more intriguing and will be more successful.
Yeah.
They're very rarely that mysterious and dark in real life. If you're one of their friends.
I've met many of them. They're not mysterious and dark. They're usually very nice and sometimes even very friendly. Yeah, that's a really good point. So if you find yourself in a place where you're hearing what we're saying and you're either like, yeah, guys, I'm with you. I've done that. I'm there. How do I start figuring out the branding elements? Or you're like, okay, cool. I am going to sit down for a couple hours and really suss out who I want to be to my marketplace and what I want to stand for and how I want them to think about me in the long term. Then you can start thinking about, okay, well, like how does my iconography fall into that? How do my colors fall into that? What might that look like? You could even be thinking about maybe this falls into a rebrand strategy for you. You might be hearing all this and being like, wow, nothing I do right now aligns at all. So I'm going to have to look at a rebrand. Good. Like if this episode does that for you, great. Like I hope it does. But you can start to think about these things and ask yourself some questions and give yourself some prompts about, the more fundamentals of branding elements, which is, like Cirque said, something that we conflate branding to branding elements, and they're not the same thing. It's a nested part of a brand. And to help you guys with that, we have an artist branding workbook that's free. We're going to leave a link to it in the show notes. You can grab it, the download for it. You can sit down with it, maybe give yourself another 30 minutes to an hour to 2 hours, depending on how long you want to take with it. Maybe sit down with your band if you have a band, or sit down with your songwriting partner or your business partner or your best friend or whatever, and walk through the prompts and the questions in this workbook and answer them based on the mission and the vision that you've come up with. And these are all related to your logo, your color scheme, your iconography, the visual imagery, both static and video, and the types of things that make you tick. Sometimes you're going to pull influences from other artists, even if you sound nothing like them. And we talk about that a little bit in the workbook as well. And so they're kind of meant to be helpful prompts to get you going in a branding direction.
Yeah. And it's made by one of the best branding and graphic design and UX guys I know.
Yeah.
We pulled no punches in hiring the best to do this. So
yeah, Casey's amazing. Casey Schumacher made this, and it's an amazing resource. you absolutely should grab it. Like I said, it's free. We'll leave a link to it in the show notes. But if you're doing some of the deep work that we've been talking about as we're going into 2024 here, and as we're into our first few weeks of the new year, this might be a good thing for you to think about if you're in a place where you've got a mission and a vision built out in your brain, and you've got a market, and you're not just, kind of playing branding activity games ahead of time. This would be a good resource for you to use. I say that to kind of qualify like who this would be right to experiment with, and who should, work on running some ads and getting their music out to people first.
Yeah.
You don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Definitely not.
Well, I hope you guys dug this, and I hope you dig the branding workbook. It's definitely a helpful set of exercises to bring you to a place where you're building something visually that you really dig, that you feel like aligns with who you are and what you're about and what you're trying to represent. So check it out. Hope you like it. Hope you dug this episode. We don't get to talk about branding much. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Branding goes from like ethereal, sort of like pie in the sky ideas to granular, get on your computer and design pretty quick. It's like a slide.
Yeah.
I love it. This was fun. Thanks so much, dude. And thank you guys for listening.
Have a good one, Indies. We'll see you next time.
Peace.